The house was too cheap for its size. That was the first thing that caught Alan's attention. A 4-bedroom Victorian on the edge of a small college town, sold as is after the death of its longtime owner, a reclusive literature professor named Ernest Mallory. The listing had been up for months. No takers. The locals said the place had mold issues and rats, but Alan wasn't deterred. He wanted space, privacy, a place to work. The inside smelled like paper and old carpet, the kind of air that settled into your clothes. Dust hung like a haze in every room. Boxes of yellowed books were still stacked along the walls, most unopened. The kitchen hadn't seen a working appliance in decades, but the bones were good, the floors sturdy, and Alan had money for renovations. By the second week, he'd cleared out the upper floor and hired a crew to check behind the old plaster walls. That's when they found the door. It wasn't marked on any plans. Behind what used to be a built-in bookshelf, sealed by drywall and a layer of pink insulation, was a narrow wooden door with a tarnished brass knob. No keyhole, just a faint gap beneath it and the smell of mildew. Alan hesitated before opening it. There was something about the way it faced the hallway, not centered, but angled slightly like it had been wedged in as an afterthought. When he pushed it open, the hinges let out a metallic groan that echoed unnaturally through the house. The room beyond was untouched by time. A small study, maybe 12 feet across, lined wall to wall with overflowing bookshelves. A wide desk sat at the center, lit by a single high window smeared with grime. The air was heavier inside, warmer, like the room had been sealed just yesterday. Dust coated everything, but nothing seemed disturbed. Not even the chair pushed slightly back from the desk, or the typewriter frozen mid-sentence. Alan stepped closer, drawn to the page still rolled into the machine. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were legible. It was the opening to a story fiction, probably. A detailed description of a man found buried in a shallow grave near the town reservoir. The style was dry and clinical, almost like a case report, with dates, locations, and physical evidence listed precisely. The name of the victim meant nothing to Alan, but something about the tone unsettled him. He scanned a few more lines, then noticed another page lying under a stack of books beside the typewriter. More details, another case. A missing woman this time, her last known sighting at a gas station on Route 4. Same tone, same structure. A string of disappearances, murders, suicides, all written in the same detached voice, as though the author had been there, had seen everything firsthand. Alan spent the rest of the night in that room, reading. Some of the names started to sound familiar. Others he looked up and found news articles, cold case files, blogs. The crimes were real, and every detail in the pages matched public records perfectly, or went even further. He didn't sleep that night. When he finally left the study, the morning sun was already pressing through the windows of the main hall, but the air felt colder now. Like the house knew he'd read something he shouldn't have. Alan didn't go back into the study for 2 days. He told himself it was because of work, that he needed to focus on his freelance projects and not some dusty manuscript. But in truth, he'd been avoiding the house altogether, spending long hours at coffee shops and driving aimlessly through town. When he finally returned, he brought gloves and a camera. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find. A draft of a novel, maybe. a true crime passion project by a retired academic. But the tone of the writing still clawed at him. It wasn't imaginative. It wasn't trying to entertain or theorize. It was ... reporting. Inside the study, everything was as he had left it. The typewriter still held the half-written page. The stack of loose papers beside it had grown, or maybe he'd missed a few the first time. Some were typed, others handwritten in the same neat script, all unsigned. The pages continued the strange pattern, one account after another, each crime more obscure, many of them local. Some were decades old, with barely any online footprint. Others, he realized, were as recent as the last 5 years. He searched for the name of the author, the date of the writing, anything that could frame these stories as fiction. There were no headers, no drafts, no corrections. Just clean, final versions. Even the typewriter ribbon was still fresh, as though someone had used it only weeks ago. Alan began cross-referencing each story. It took hours, sometimes days. His internet history filled with coroner's reports, local police logs, Reddit threads about unsolved murders. The details in the papers never deviated, even when they weren't public knowledge. In one report, a missing teenager's shoes were found stuffed into an irrigation pipe. In the actual case file, that information had been redacted. In another, a family of 3 was found suffocated in their car, with the garage door taped shut from the outside, and the manuscript noted the brand of tape used, a detail mentioned only once in a now-defunct newspaper archive. There were too many of these moments to ignore. Whoever wrote these pages had access to something. Then came the entry that broke his denial completely. It described a murder-suicide from 6 years ago. A quiet man who killed his wife and then himself in a rental cabin upstate. Alan recognized the location. He'd been living in the same town when it happened. But what made his chest tighten was the mention of a third person, a witness who had been in the area, questioned by police, and later cleared. The manuscript described the witness's clothing, his exact vehicle make, his reason for being nearby. It described Alan, word for word, down to a detail he'd never told anyone, that he hadn't gone hiking that day because he was sick, and he'd only driven out there to be alone. He had never spoken to police. He hadn't even been close enough to hear the sirens. But someone had seen him, and had written him into a story long before he found this house. He rifled through the pages, breath short, hands shaking. There were more reports, more cases. He scanned the endings of each, searching for a pattern, a clue, anything that made this less personal, until he reached the newest one, a fresh page tucked underneath the typewriter's cover panel. There was no title, just a single paragraph. A man in his 30s inherits an old house. He begins to read things he shouldn't. He starts to dig too deeply. The final lines simply read. He didn't realize the story wasn't finished yet. He spent nights in motels along the interstate, taking only a backpack and the most recent pages with him. The study remained locked, the door handle wrapped in painter's tape like a crime scene. Still, the pressure of the house lingered in his chest, a weight that didn't lift even when he was miles away. Something was watching how he reacted, measuring how close he'd come to understanding. On the 3rd night away, he opened the oldest file box he'd found in the study. It contained utility bills, university memos, and a manila folder with no label. Inside was a letter never sent, addressed to someone named Leland Franks. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched the notes on the manuscript margins. The letter wasn't personal. It read more like a confession. The professor wrote about documenting what others refused to see, about how official records were revisions, and how his work would outlive red tape, trial errors, and corruption. He claimed his writing was evidence, not fiction. There was mention of threats, veiled ones, and of a name that kept showing up too often in missing persons cases. The final line, "If anything happens to me, the records are in the study. It's all there." Even him. Alan searched for Leland Franks. No academic results. No books. Just a single archived newspaper mention from 1978. A teenager questioned in connection with a series of disappearances in Ohio, never charged. The article noted he was released after a polygraph and faded into obscurity. But the dates matched. Some of the earliest case files in the professor's manuscript overlapped those same years. Alan followed the trail to a nursing home outside Cincinnati. The name had changed, but the records showed a man with no family named Leland F., admitted under state care. He died the year before. The photo on the intake file showed an older man with deep-set eyes and a faint scar over his brow, the same face from the black-and-white photo Alan had found in the manuscript's earlier pages. That photo had been labeled witness, not suspect, not victim, just witness. Alan drove back to the house that night. He felt cornered, not by anyone living, but by a pattern, something obsessive, systematic. The professor hadn't been haunted by a ghost. He'd been tracing a human, someone who moved between states, between identities, leaving barely enough evidence to call attention, but never enough to convict. And whoever he was, he'd kept writing. When Alan entered the study, it smelled different. Paper, cold dust, and something else, like a room that had been opened just recently after too long sealed. The typewriter had a new page in it. He hadn't put it there. The story continued where the last left off. No heading. Just words. The man finally understood. He knew who had started the file. He even knew who had continued it. But he never asked the real question. Who was still updating it now? Alan stepped back, heart-hammering, scanning the room. There was no sign of a break-in. The windows were locked. The door had been taped shut. The final sentence was typed in a slightly different font. A cleaner, newer imprint, like a different machine had been used. Or someone had replaced the ribbon. He returned to the study, it read, because some part of him wanted to be included. The house had been listed for auction for nearly 2 years. Alan had found it by accident, scanning foreclosure listings late at night, half looking for an investment, half looking for an escape. A 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch, overgrown yard, and just enough history to seem romantic. The photos showed dust and faded wallpaper, but structurally it looked sound. The price was impossibly low. The day the keys were handed over, Alan walked through the house alone. The silence was thick, not peaceful, but heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The first floor was standard. Empty rooms, scuffed wood, brittle light. Upstairs was stranger. At the top of the staircase, directly ahead, was a door unlike the others. Older, narrower. The doorknob was tarnished brass, and the lock was sealed with rust. It didn't match any of the keys he'd been given. The other rooms opened easily, revealing nothing but age and neglect. But this door refused to budge, even when Alan leaned into it with his shoulder. Neighbors were scarce, but one older man from across the street paused long enough to say the upstairs door had been locked since before my kids were born. No one had ever seen it open. No one remembered what was inside. At first, Alan thought little of it. Probably an attic space or some sealed storage room. But by the second week, something began to bother him. Every few nights, always past midnight, a sound echoed from upstairs, soft, irregular. Not loud enough to wake him entirely, but just enough to stay in his dreams. A dragging shuffle. A light tap. Once, something like fingernails across wood. He assumed mice or raccoons in the walls. Old homes made noise. But when he finally brought up the courage to listen closely, the sounds weren't coming from the walls. They came from behind the locked door. Alan bought tools. He tried oiling the hinges, prying the frame, even calling a locksmith who refused once he saw the rusted state of the lock and heard which house it was. In the end, Alan did it himself. He chipped the lock until it cracked like bone, then pushed the door inward. It opened with a long, aching creak that seemed to bleed into the rest of the house. The room behind it was dark. No windows, no visible light source, and a smell that wasn't quite decay, but wasn't clean either. Sweat, maybe. Damp clothes. Lived-in air. There was a small mattress on the floor. A blanket, still warm. A folding table with a half-full water bottle. A phone charger plugged into an outlet, blinking red. A crate filled with wrappers and old newspapers, carefully folded. And next to the mattress, a small cloth-bound notebook with a cracked spine. Alan picked it up with shaking hands. It was a journal. The entries were scattered, written in uneven, rushed handwriting. Observations about the weather. Notes about keeping quiet during the day. Mentions of someone almost hearing me come down the stairs. One entry described waiting for him to leave so I can shower. Then Alan saw the final page, dated the exact day he moved in, written in thicker ink, as if the pen had pressed harder. He finally opened the door. Alan stood frozen in the doorway, the journal still in his hand. The air in the small room was dense with the residue of recent occupation, body heat, breath, the faint tang of old food. He backed out slowly, careful not to touch anything else, then shut the door and locked it from the outside using a bolt he installed himself that evening. He didn't call the police. He should have. But something about the room made it feel personal, like trespassing into someone's unspoken threat. Reporting it would mean explaining why he'd broken open a locked room without clearance, why he'd waited 2 weeks to investigate the sounds, why he'd taken the journal. It would mean admitting he'd been sleeping below someone who'd lived inches above him, listening. Instead, he installed a motion camera outside the door, silent infrared, linked directly to his phone. The next 2 nights, nothing happened. No motion, no sound. On the 3rd night, the alert came at 2:14. Eye movement detected outside the upstairs door. Alan tapped the feed with trembling fingers. The hallway was dimly lit by a small bulb overhead, casting long shadows along the floor. In the center of the screen, the door handle turned slowly, deliberately, before falling still. Then nothing. No footsteps. No exit. Just a handle turning once, then silence. The next morning he checked the door again. Still locked from the outside. Still undisturbed. Inside, everything remained untouched, except the journal. It had been moved. It now lay open to a new page, blank except for one word. Stop? Alan stopped sleeping. He began combing through every document he had on the house. Old deeds, auction reports, newspaper archives. Most of the paperwork was incomplete or poorly scanned. The house had changed ownership many times. There was no record of renovations upstairs. No floor plan that included that room. He found a single article dated back 20 years. Man found squatting in attic of rental home. Different house, same neighborhood. The photo of the squatter was too grainy to make out clearly, but the description was disturbing. He'd lived in silence for months above a family of 4, sneaking down only when they were gone, using their bathroom, eating scraps. The police found journals describing every detail of their lives. Alan realized then that whoever had been living behind the upstairs door wasn't new. They were practiced, patient, someone who knew how to stay hidden in the spaces no one paid attention to. And now he had disturbed that balance. That night he locked his bedroom door for the first time. He didn't sleep. He didn't turn off the lights. And he left his phone on his chest, camera feed open. At 3:12 a.m., another alert. Motion detected. Upstairs hallway. He watched as the door to the room opened on its own, slowly, almost politely. No figure stepped out. Just the door swinging wide, revealing the darkness inside. The feed froze. The screen went black. Alan stared at the black screen until the sun rose, then went upstairs with a flashlight and a hammer. The hallway was exactly as it had been the night before. The door to the room now stood open again. He stepped inside carefully, expecting to find someone, a squatter, maybe even a body, but the space was empty. Mattress, table, crate, all gone. Only the journal remained. He flipped through the pages. Every entry had been torn out. All that remained was the inside back cover, where something had been written directly onto the cardboard lining with a thick marker. The lock wasn't to keep me in. Alan left the house that morning and didn't go back for 2 weeks. When he returned, it was broad daylight, and he brought a friend, someone to walk through each room with him, someone to make it feel less like stepping into a trap. Nothing was missing from the rest of the house, but the upstairs room was bare now, scraped clean. Not even dust on the floor, as if someone had vacuumed every trace of presence away. Alan removed the door entirely, took it down off its hinges, and left it leaning against the wall in the garage. He didn't want anything in his home that had stood between him and whatever had been behind it. Things calmed down for a while. The nights were quiet. No motion alerts, no sounds from above. But Alan never slept deeply again. He'd lie awake most nights, listening, waiting for a creak or a whisper or the return of the door turning in its frame. 3 months later, a manila envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address. Inside were a set of printed photos, grainy, low-light images taken from a trail camera. A narrow figure was visible in the distance in each shot, walking along a tree line, crouching in undergrowth, sitting just beyond the frame of a porch light. In one image, the figure stood directly in front of a window. Alan's window. He flipped to the last photo. It was taken inside a different house entirely. Different walls, different furniture, but the door in the photo was unmistakable. The same narrow shape, the same tarnished brass knob, the same frame. It wasn't leaning in a garage anymore. It had been installed again, somewhere else